Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes. We try to alert you to some great theories and discoveries out there that you've probably never heard of before, because they are obscure and maybe somewhat esoteric, maybe even conspiratorial. But if you did know about them, they would affect your life in profound ways. And today is our 189th Bible Decode, coming all from the New Testament, and mostly exploring the ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis, that the New Testament was written in whole or in part by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. Now, there are a few Roman origins people who maybe think it's more related to Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar, but most authors say that the New Testament was written by the Flavians. That's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, between 69 and 96 AD. The theory goes that they wrote the Gospels and then backdated the story by over 40 years. Simultaneously, they wrote a history of the war between the Romans and the Jews that occurred between 66 and 73 BC. Vespasian and Titus, before they became emperors, were the military generals in this war. So they are basically the protagonists, at least a good portion of this history that is called War of the Jews. And that is in 7 volumes. And it was written under the name of Flavius Josephus. Another Flavian, this time by adoption. And according to his autobiography, he was a Jew who was a military commander in this war until he surrendered to Emperor Vespasian, or General Vespasian. And at that point, he recognized that the Jews are no longer the favorites of God, but the Romans are. And so he defected to the Romans and gave Vespasian the prophecy that he would one day become emperor. And when he did, he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, made him the court historian, put him up at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. Just that story enough should tell you that Josephus is not telling the truth about things, because that's not what the Romans do to their enemies. But anyway, whoever Josephus is or was, he was an agent of the Romans, living at Caesar's palace, and his work is being heavily endorsed by Titus and Vespasian. Now, the motive for the Romans was that they were trying to mellow out the Jews, or pacify or tame or domesticate the Jews, because the Jews were constantly revolting and insurrecting all the way back to 63 BC, when the Romans first pulled into Judea. And this is right down the alley of the Romans' MO. They had created a number of other religions here in the first century for psychological warfare purposes. PSYOP, and this was no different. Titus himself had created 2 other religions, Vespasian at least 1. They did the same thing to the Jews, a different kind of Jew, the Pharisaic Jews, with their rabbinical Judaism school, with a story from the leader, Yohanan ben Zakkai, which is practically identical to the story of Josephus, how he predicted that one day Vespasian, or maybe it was Titus, would become the emperor. And then when he did, he got hooked up with a land grant to study the Torah. And so that was a way to kind of distract the Pharisees from any type of political revolt and move them into this kind of more philosophical, textual detail of rabbinical Judaism. Anyway, those are just the circumstantials. There's also that the Romans had a monopoly over censorship, over publishing, over distribution. They were the only people who even could have written the Gospels. They're written in Greek, the language of the Romans. Now, the Roman elite also spoke Latin, but the common language at that time was Greek, unlike in Judea, where the language of choice was Aramaic, and very few people wrote or spoke in Greek. Very few people wrote at all. But we're supposed to believe that these illiterate apostles were the authors of this kind of pretty sophisticated Greek writing called the Gospels. But the proof is goes much further and more factual than all of that. If you read War of the Jews, you will discover that it is a companion piece to the Gospels. Joseph Atwill takes a look at the book of Luke in his book Caesar's Messiah and the War of the Jews, and notices that the 3-year ministry of Jesus is a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order, and wherever they go, they have events that are parallel to one another. And and all of the events are dated 40 years apart. And we're talking about dozens of events, like over 40 separate events in the same order in the two books. Michael Menescotts comes along last year and writes his book Christianity's Origins as Flavian Secrecy Cult. And he dug into the book of Luke and discovered over 250 separate parallels between the two books. Some of the parallels are incredibly detailed and well put together and required a great deal of thought to put together. Some of them are more offhanded and could be dismissed as coincidence if encountered, alone. But with 250 of them, you have to assume that most of them are intentional. And not only that, but then Menescotts graphs the parallels on a chart using the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plots all the points and forms 5 near-perfect letters in Latin. APTVS. Aries, Peso, Titus, Vespasianus, or something to that effect. The main point is that not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they signed their names to it. And so you believe in that book and the rest of the Gospels at your peril. They are making fun of you. They are mocking you. They are ridiculing you for being so gullible. Joseph Atwill calls the Gospels the world's first intelligence test. And the price for failing that test is belief in a false god. I don't even believe that the Romans would have even considered that their psychological operation would have lasted for 2,000 years. But here we are. And, there are not many people watching these videos, so it could go on for thousands of more years unless people start to wake up to this. But most people have cognitive dissonance, and most people are emotionally invested in their own religion. And so they don't really care about the facts or the evidence, because there is no evidence of the existence of Jesus. I challenge somebody to give me one piece of evidence that is not of Roman origin, of Roman Empire origin, like one of the Roman royals or their family members or their court, their agents. There isn't any other evidence. All of it is Roman. And so the belief in biblical Christianity is exactly the same as the belief in Santa Claus. There's no evidence, and at some point you will grow up and you will recognize your folly and you'll chuckle at it. Oh yeah, well, I was only 5 years old and I believed in this. But unfortunately now you'll say I believed in this for my whole freaking life. So it's tough medicine, but it's like maybe I'm your older brother telling you, hey, that Santa Claus stuff, it's not real. I know that hurts to hear it, but it isn't. And that's, my main beef with Christianity is just that it's fiction. I mean, the Romans wanted you to be a good citizen. And so Christianity pumps out good citizens, hardworking, honest, law-abiding citizens. But that doesn't justify it, because it's a lie. There are other ways to create, law-abiding citizens. And there may also be other times where, you don't need to be a law-abiding citizen. But so that was their basic, idea, to mellow out the Jews. The Jews were waiting for a Messiah, but the Jews were waiting for a military Messiah who would help them kick out the Romans. And so instead, the Flavians, the Romans, wrote about a Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, meanwhile disrupting the Jewish rituals by overturning the tables of money changers outside the temple and excoriating the Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice inside the temple. The Jesus of the Gospels is completely deferential toward Rome, never ever saying anything against the Romans, while constantly harping on aspects of the Jews that are unfavorable. So now what we're doing is, we had just gone through a book of Christian apologetics from Lee Strobel called The Case for Christ, and I was arguing as we went through the book that because they are ignorant of the Roman origins hypothesis, whether that is voluntary or involuntary, they present a case for Christ that actually is a better case for Caesar. They a lot of times end up in places where they say, well, there is no good explanation, or I challenge you to give me a better explanation than God did the resurrection. And, the Roman origins hypothesis is that better explanation. but they're not aware of it. And so they're arguing for this being a case for Christ, but it actually makes a much better case for Caesar. Now we're looking at a book called Nailed by David Fitzgerald, which is kind of the opposite. It's a book from more the atheistic, skeptical perspective. And I guess I wouldn't even use those two terms, maybe skeptical in quotes, because I think atheists are even worse than Christians because they believe in science, which is even more of a racket than the religion part is, because there's more money involved in it. You know, NASA is getting trillions of dollars, or at one point, you know, to do all kinds of fake stuff. And, you know, the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical complex, you know, they're all wanting you to basically follow science blindly, just like Santa Claus again. You know, roll up your sleeve, don't ask any questions, don't you trust the science? So, I don't know that Fitzgerald goes that far into being a kind of a, you know, the kind of guy who would spell climate change with 2 capital C's, or spell evolution with a capital E. But he is also ignorant of the Roman origins hypothesis, and so he misses a lot here. Now, right now he's talking about Pontius Pilate. He says Pontius Pilate also comes from an alternate reality, meaning that how he's being portrayed in the Gospels is a million miles away from. He says they unanimously portray him as concerned but indecisive worrywart who can't bring himself to execute Jesus but is too weak to prevent it. All he can do is plead with the crowd, waffle back and forth, and let the Jews push him around until they threaten to tell Caesar on him if he refuses to do what they say and kill Jesus. At this point, he gets so scared that he finally just gives in and literally washes his hands of the whole thing. Pilate punctuates his interrogation with trips back and forth to talk to the crowd. That's in Luke 23. The person he's citing here, Cone, finds this whole scenario so ludicrous as to border on the absurd. What proud Roman governor would keep jumping from his lordly seat of judgment at odd intervals and running out to the courtyard to talk with a mob? Not only talk the multitudes into choosing to free a murderer over their beloved Messiah, but actually whip them up into a frenzied mob howling for Jesus' blood. So, and you know, that goes against the portrayals of Pilate, Pontius Pilate, so in Josephus. Now, Josephus can't be, you know, taken as a real source either. Josephus is every bit as fiction as the Gospels are. But Josephus presents Pilate as being kind of more of a cruel and bloodthirsty tyrant. So that's an interesting tension there. So I think we're at the next myth. I'm not sure which one this is, number 6. He's going into John 18. Remember, just 12 hours earlier, they were so very much afraid of public uproar, the Romans, or that if Jesus were to be arrested in the open, that they had to seize him at night and illegally hold a secret. Oh, so this is the Jews. This is Jewish leaders. 12 hours earlier, they were so very much afraid of public uproar if Jesus were to be arrested in the open that they had to seize him at night and illegally hold a secret trial in a private house. But apparently all it took to sway the fickle multitude was some spirited cheerleading. Why were they ever worried? Okay, and this is a point that Joseph Atwill brings up. Barabbas, who is the terrorist that the Jews choose to free instead of Jesus. Now, the whole idea that the Jews and the Romans never had a system like this during Passover, that they would pardon one person as a Passover ritual. That never there's no evidence for that ever happening. But the person named Barabbas, that name means son of the Father. And if you look at some of the other manuscripts of Barabbas, he's known as Jesus Barabbas. And Atwill points that out. Atwill points out that there are at least 4 Jesuses in the New Testament that cause a significant confusion, that are there on purpose in order to do so. The New Testament is an enigma. It is one puzzle after another. These are the games that the Romans loved to play. They loved riddles and typology and alias names and switching names. So, this is exactly what they would do. Okay, Mark's setup also duplicates the two goals, the 2 goats tradition held every year in the temple on Yom Kippur. There can be no doubt this is what Mark is doing. He is creating a fictional story that echoes the Jewish Day of Atonement ceremony. Therefore, it is fiction. Now, Josephus and whoever the Romans were that wrote the Gospels, probably a lot of the Herods were involved. Obviously, these people knew a decent amount about Judaism. This might have been beyond the ken of any purebred Roman, but the Herods were kind of like the puppet kings of Judea that were clients of Rome and lived at Rome, along with Josephus, this guy Tiberius Alexander, this woman Berenike, who was a Herod, but I think the Herods were also connected with the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, which was kind of like a ruling dynasty of the Jews dating back all the way to the 2nd century BC. And Roman Peso demonstrates how Herod, the original Herod, the king, was a Hasmonean. They call him an Idumean, which is further south from Judea, but he shows that he has some blood from the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans. Okay. So this person is just going over how this is such a foolish story, especially the parts that we were just talking about, giving a trading terrorist and letting Jesus get crucified instead. If a condemned criminal was discovered somehow alive again, the authorities would simply do a better job of making sure that he and all his accomplices were executed properly. Instead, we find that for the Roman authorities, the question of Jesus is nothing but some obscure Jewish religious dispute, and it's not just the Romans with amnesia. Paul's Jesus is just his invisible friend, the talking light in the sky. All that Paul knows about Jesus is what Moses and the prophets revealed in the scriptures, that the Christ would suffer, rise from the dead, and proclaim light to all. And if you look at the Paul epistles, both the ones that he really wrote and the ones that, they've discovered that he didn't write, they're all even more pro-Roman than Jesus' Gospels are. Okay, here he says, the Gospels portray Judea and the Galilee as a peaceful, idyllic countryside under benign Roman rule instead of what they really were, which was areas of, like, war. The Jews were constantly revolting. So it was a high tension time, the whole first century, both BC and AD. The Gospels paint Galilee already under the theological thumb of the Pharisees, but this appears to be about 40 years too early. So he's pointing at the year 70, that's where the rabbinical Judaism started, there at Javne. And that's this guy, Yohanan ben Zakkai. And then the second in charge is named Okolos, who was a direct descendant of the Flavians. So the direct descendant of the Flavians is, I think he was the Pope, Clement of Rome. He was the Pope's son, and he is one of the leaders of rabbinical Judaism. So that sounds like a psyop to me. Pharisees were certainly a major presence in the Galilee after the priesthood and legal schools were relocated there after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the same time when the Gospels were written. But were they so prominent in... Any Pharisees during the pre-war period would most likely have been outsiders and hardly influential. I don't know about that. Josephus, I'm talking pure fiction here. Just from what Josephus says, he would disagree. That's the thing, is that all of our sources are fraudulent. The only real sources that we have to go on with any meat on the bone are the Gospels and Josephus for the whole first century, until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s and 50s. But they didn't really get translated properly until the early 1990s. And by that time, most of the people that were gung-ho to find out what they said were already dead. And so it's, they did a pretty good job, the Catholic Church, of pretty much diffusing or, obscuring the Dead Sea Scrolls. They clearly say a lot of things that the Catholics didn't want to put out there. In particular, that they were written probably around the same time that Jesus was living, and they never mention him or anybody else who appears in the New Testament. They also never mention the Essenes, who I certainly don't believe existed, because the only people who talk about the Essenes are Josephus and Philo, and who was a Jew, but he was close to he was Tiberius Alexander's brother, I believe, maybe brother, and I believe Pliny the Elder are the only people that have ever talked about the Essenes. Not mentioned in the New Testament, not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but people love to, think that Jesus was a member of the Essenes. Indication that Greek epics like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey inspired Mark. It is natural that stories set in the Greek Isles would involve a great deal of seagoing, but such nautical episodes seem very far out of place if you try to graft them into a rural Palestinian setting. Now, he talks about the Sea of Galilee, which is pretty funny because When you think of a sea, you think of the Mediterranean Sea or the Caspian Sea or something like that. The Sea of Galilee was 7 miles long and 4 miles wide. MacDonald reveals a surprising fact. No one ever referred to this lake as a sea before Mark did. And even Luke occasionally corrected Mark, which he never did, calling it by its real name and proper term, Lake Chinnereth. So that is at least weak evidence that Mark maybe got a lot of his stuff from Homer, or got some of his stuff from Homer. But maybe Luke did too, because they both, Luke has that story of the shipwreck, which also Josephus has the same story. Some authors think that Josephus and Paul must have been on the same ship that got shipwrecked in the early 60s. Jesus and the disciples have to battle life-threatening storms and powerful waves on the Sea of Galilee, which obviously wouldn't happen. Another gospel locale that seems to be picked for literary allegory is when Luke tells us that the risen Jesus appears to 2 of his followers traveling on the road to Emmaus, a village near Jerusalem. But the entire incident seems to be taken from the ancient Roman legend of Romulus, which also would, along with the thing about Homer, which would lend credence to a Roman origins hypothesis. These people were putting in Greek and Roman legends into the Gospels, which probably reflects their area of expertise. When plotted on a map, Jesus' travels make no sense. He pops here and there, seemingly at random. And as we've just seen, the Gospel's authors appeared happy to make new towns as needed, though some seem accidentally created by later scribes. I wonder what Joseph Atwell would say about all that. If he says that Titus and Jesus went to the same locations, we will definitely be revisiting that that series of what Atwell calls the Flavian signature. Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, which is a fraud. It's not his second letter to the Thessalonians was not written by Paul, according to scholars. But apparently it repeatedly warns Christians to beware of letters forged in Paul's name. Majority of biblical scholars